Hello. To understand the idea of race in the United States, we need to go back in time. Now, in Module 6, you learned about the earliest people who migrated into the Western Hemisphere, about 15,000 years ago. Moving into an unoccupied territory opened up a wealth of opportunity. And these people flourished. There was a significant amount of population growth, cultural innovation, and expansion. And the diversity of the native languages that we see, they demonstrate this really well. So in Module 6, I showed you this language map of indigenous languages in North and South America. There's a high number of linguistic isolates. In North America, including Mexico, there are 26 of them, and there are 55 of them in South America. Now, for comparison, there is just one linguistic isolate in Europe, 9 in Asia, and just 10 in Africa. Now, the concept of race in the United States, well, it isn't from the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, though. This is an idea born out of European history. So let's go there. Let's go first to the first millennium AD, to the part of the world where the Old Testament was central to religious beliefs. This brings us to this large geographic region around the Mediterranean Sea. In this region, it falls nicely into a tripartite set of categories, a tripartite view. There's Europe to the north, Africa to the south, and Arabia to the west. So roughly speaking, Europe, Africa, and Asia. In the book of Genesis, in the Old Testament, Noah had 3 sons who were interpreted to be the progenitors of the people living in these 3 major geographic regions. According to the Old Testament, after the Great Flood, all people on earth spoke the same language, and together they started to build a tower tall enough to reach heaven, which God did not appreciate. He decided to put a stop to this, and his method of choice was to confound their ability to talk with each other, creating many different languages so that they couldn't understand each other, and he scattered them around the world. There was Japheth, the youngest of Noah's son, and he was considered to be the father of Indo-Europeans, and he traveled to the north after the Tower of Babel incident. Shem, his descendants were the Asians, as he had headed east, and Ham's descendants were the Africans, as he had headed south. Now, this explanation, it worked. It was neat and tidy. Everything fit together. It made sense. Well, it made sense until it didn't. In order to understand how that understanding all broke down, we need to focus our attention on the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal are today, and highlighted on this map in yellow. In 500 AD, this region of the world was controlled by a Germanic people called the Visigoths. This map shows in orange the geographic extent of the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania. This kingdom brought together the Gothic people from the north and the Hispano-Romans in the south. Now, they were increasingly intermixed with less and less distinction between them, and by 600 AD, when the kingdom formally aligned with the Catholic Church, the language and cultural differences were diminished as well. But that didn't mean that they got along. The next 200 years was wrought with a lot of infighting amongst the nobles. Maps of this region between 500 and 700 AD, they show the boundaries of the regions constantly changing as wars broke out and regicide was common. Now, in 711, North African Berbers took advantage of the disharmony. Now referred to as the Moors, the Muslim Berbers crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and gradually gained control over more and more land on the Iberian Peninsula. By the 12th century, the region was controlled by an Islamic kingdom called the Realm of the Almohads. You may know of some of the spectacular architecture across Spain. constructed by the Moors, such as the Court of Lions, as shown from the Alhambra, the Palace of Nasrid, Granada, in this picture here. Now, over the 700 years of Moorish reign, Muslims, Jews, and Catholics all lived on the peninsula, sometimes fighting, sometimes getting along, and very much intermixing cultures, knowledge, and language. But unrest percolated, and gradually the Catholic kingdoms to the north began to push the Muslim kingdom out. The Crusades. The Crusades began in the late 11th century to reconquest the Iberian Peninsula, to restore the Germanic kingdom of Hispania. With that historical background, let me introduce you to two of the major players who set the course of history towards the deeply embedded concept of race in the United States: Isabella and Ferdinand, the first queen and king of Spain. Isabella had become the Queen of Castile in 1474, and 5 years later she married the King of Aragon, Ferdinand II. Together, they joined two major dynasties and formed the beginning of Spain as we currently know it. Isabella and Ferdinand set to finishing what is known as Reconquista, the forced conversion and/or expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula that began almost 500 years earlier. The Reconquista crossed a threshold in 1492 that altered the world political economy forever. In 1492, three major events happened for Isabella and Ferdinand. In January, there was the fall of Granada. This was the last holdout of the Moors, and with that military victory, the Moors were completely pushed out of Europe. This painting depicts the moment when the last Emir of Granada, a Muslim, surrendered to an army of Catholic monarchs, bringing an end to 780 years of Muslim control of Al-Andalus, the Moors' name for the area we now refer to as the Iberian Peninsula. So this war, this military operation, was a pretty expensive endeavor. Additionally, Isabella had inherited a lot of fiscal troubles from her brother, who had reigned before her, and so she and Ferdinand were keen to find new sources of money. This painting by Emanuel Lutze portrays Christopher Columbus making his case to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand for their investment in his exploration for a western passage to the Indies. Given their financial troubles, or financial concerns, in March of 1492, they agreed to sponsor his journey with the hope of entering the spice trade. Also in March, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the Alhambra Decree, setting forth the expulsion of all Jews. They had until the end of July to leave the country, and they could not take with them any valuables. It's estimated that about half of the Jews living on the Iberian Peninsula, which is estimated to have been maybe around 80 to 100,000 people, half of them left, and the other half converted to Catholicism, only later to find themselves targets of the Inquisition. Now let's pause for a moment, because I'm guessing that it might feel like I've taken you down a rabbit hole here, but it's important and fascinating to see how political economic forces shape the world we live in. We, people, humans, for many thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years, we try to make sense of the world around us. Three major events that took place in 1492 in Spain significantly altered the world economy, leading to dramatic inequities, especially here in the United States. Now, people have since sought to understand, to explain, to justify the brutality of this inequality. And as we will see over the course of this module and the next, scientists were a big part of this effort. And those scientists, especially those here in the United States, they were operating from the stance that biological differences were the root cause of the vastly different situations that Native Americans, slaves, and the European colonists had experienced. So let's turn back to the history now with an eye towards the human biological variation question. So, keep in mind that prior to Columbus's voyage west, the biblical understanding of human variation, it worked well with the range of human biological variation that the Christians, that the Catholics, had encountered. So Christopher Columbus set sail in August of 1492, returning to Spain in 1493, but not with spices, but with some indigenous North Americans and with gold. So as you know, Columbus didn't make it to the West Indies. Rather, he came upon land that no one in Europe had known existed, the quote-unquote New World. But of course, this wasn't new at all. It was North and South America, the Western Hemisphere. But to Columbus, to Queen Isabella, and King Ferdinand, this was new. Spain thus entered an era of exploration and colonization. The Spanish Empire had begun. Now, Columbus, as I mentioned, brought some of the indigenous people from the Americas back to Spain with him, along with the gold. Isabella, she was not inclined to slavery. She decreed that anyone under the rule of the Spanish crown was not to be enslaved, for the most part. Isabella ordered Columbus to return the people to their homes, arrested him, and then sponsored some other conquistadors to carry the torch of Spanish conquest and evangelization. So with this decision, this decree, Queen Isabella set the stage for not enslaving the people who were living in the Western Hemisphere. This is one of the events that tilted the trajectory of history towards the enslavement of Africans. The Portuguese, they had been dealing in slavery for quite a while by this point, but they were usually North Africans, Muslims, captured in military battles. And as the Portuguese started exploring further south along the African coast, they similarly brought back slaves as part of a military reward. But this gradually morphed into a trade situation with local African nobility. In 1455, the Catholic Church approved the Portuguese slave trade, so long as the slaves were being converted to Catholicism. And thus was born the division. Spain claimed the Western Hemisphere's gold, and Portugal claimed the African slave trade. Ultimately, it was a Portuguese slave ship that was hijacked by English pirates in 1619 that brought the first Africans to continental North America. Human labor, very cheap human labor, was thus infused into the economic foundation of the newly established British colony. Slave labor made the agricultural endeavor profitable, setting in play the economic and political foundation that ultimately led to the establishment of the United States of America. But wait a minute. Let's go back to the question of human variation, and specifically to the indigenous people Columbus met when he arrived in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, the Bible clearly states that Noah only had 3 sons. So, who were these people? How to make sense of this? Well, as was the practice then, people turned to the Catholic Church for the answer of who these people are, or if they even were people. In 1537, 33 years after Isabella was in the grave, Pope Paul III decreed that the Indians, as they were referred to, are truly men, and that they are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but, according to our information, desire exceedingly to receive it. And there you have it, this decision by the Pope in 1537. The native people of the New World must have arrived before the flood, and somehow traced back to one of Noah's, or must have arrived sometime around the flood, and must have traced back somehow to one of Noah's sons. But which one? This is a question that would fascinate Americans for the next 350 years. And we will pick up that part of the story in the next video.